My family officially erased my name from their multi-million-dollar inheritance simply because I chose to marry a man wearing a stained work uniform. I am Jade, a 29-year-old freelance editor who preferred the quiet integrity of a hard-working man over the hollow prestige of the Savannah elite. The nightmare began when my mother Judith left a cold voicemail at midnight demanding that I cancel the wedding immediately to avoid bringing further shame to our prestigious lineage. Following that, my father Lawrence delivered a 4-page handwritten letter tucked inside an empty envelope to formally announce the termination of all blood ties and financial support. On the morning of the ceremony, the sunlight filtered through the church windows to reveal a heartbreaking scene where 50 guest chairs remained hauntingly vacant. I stood alone at the massive oak doors, clutching the fabric of my inexpensive lace dress while taking a deep breath to stabilize my racing heart before entering. "If you marry that man, don't you ever dare look at our faces again," were the final words echoing in my mind as I faced the silence. My husband Silas waited at the altar with a strange, unshakable calmness, his eyes meeting mine with a depth of understanding that outweighed the rejection of my entire bloodline. Before we witness how these empty chairs turned into the biggest mistake of the Miller family, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of this incredible reversal. Your support helps me bring more justice-filled stories like this to life every single day. 18 months ago, my life would have taken a completely different direction if my old car had not broken down in the middle of a deserted warehouse district. I found myself stranded at the Savannah port unloading area at 2 o'clock in the morning among towering rows of containers and the dim flickering floodlights of the industrial zone. The silence of the docks felt heavy until a man emerged from the shadows wearing a grease-stained loading uniform that looked like it had seen years of hard labor. Silas approached my smoking hood without hesitation, his movements being remarkably decisive as he began inspecting the engine with the expertise of a seasoned mechanic. He did not ask many questions, instead, focused his entire attention on the mechanical failure while I stood shivering in the damp night air. After several minutes of clanking metal, the engine finally roared back to life, signaling that he had successfully fixed the complicated issue within a remarkably short time. I immediately reached into my purse to offer him a fair amount of cash for his late-night assistance, yet he firmly refused the money with a calm shake of his head. Instead of accepting the payment, he pointed toward the warm cup of coffee I was holding and asked if he could have a single sip to get through his remaining shift. We ended up spending 10 minutes sitting on the hood of my car, discussing the grueling nature of night shifts and the reasons behind his choice of such physically demanding labor. Silas spoke with a sharp, sophisticated clarity that made me realize he was nothing like the uneducated laborers my family often described with such disdain. His insights regarding the global shipping industry were surprisingly profound, making me wonder why a man of his intellect was spending his nights moving heavy crates for minimum wage. Despite the grime on his face, his steady gaze possessed an undeniable dignity that commanded respect, regardless of his humble occupation. When it was finally time for me to drive away, the calm expression in his eyes remained etched in my mind as a hauntingly beautiful mystery. I could not stop thinking about our brief encounter during the following days, which eventually drove me to return to the docks 3 nights later just to see him once more. The industrial landscape of Savannah suddenly seemed less cold because I knew a man like Silas was working somewhere deep within those massive metal labyrinths. My intuition told me that there was much more to his story than what he chose to reveal under those flickering port lights. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the deep resonance of his voice explaining the beauty of the harbor at sunrise. This unexpected connection felt more genuine than any of the forced interactions I had experienced within my social circle of wealthy elites. My heart raced with a strange mixture of anxiety and excitement as I pulled my car into the same loading zone, hoping that fate would allow our paths to cross again. 6 months after our first encounter at the port, Silas moved into my small rented apartment, bringing only a few simple wooden crates filled with his personal belongings. Our shared life began within those narrow walls where the floorboards creaked under his steady footsteps every morning before the sun dared to rise. Silas consistently departed our home at precisely 3 o'clock in the morning after receiving brief phone calls from a satellite device I had never seen anyone else use. I firmly believed that he was taking on extra grueling night shifts at the Savannah docks just to save enough money for our collective future together. This devotion touched my heart deeply, making me overlook the strange secrecy surrounding his late-night departures and the high-end technology he carried. Despite his humble appearance as a manual laborer, he frequently engaged me in complex discussions regarding maritime shipping charts and the intricacies of global supply chains. He spoke with the authority of a seasoned executive rather than a simple loader dissecting economic trends with a level of precision that often left me speechless. I watched him study massive logistical maps laid out on our small kitchen table, while the rest of the world remained fast asleep. Whenever I questioned his profound knowledge, Silas would merely offer a modest smile before steering the conversation back to my own daily struggles. I only do what is necessary to ensure the cargo arrives safely at the docks. Jade, he would often remark while preparing a simple pot of coffee. The level of care Silas provided was incredibly sophisticated, as he always prepared my breakfast and laid out vitamins whenever my freelance editing work pushed me toward exhaustion. He possessed an uncanny ability to sense my stress levels before I even uttered a single word of complaint about my demanding clients. During the quiet hours of the early morning, I would often find him sitting in our single armchair, reading international financial reports before finally going to bed. These elite habits felt strangely out of place in our modest surroundings, yet they added a layer of mystery that made my love for him grow stronger. He never complained about the physical toll of his supposed job, always focusing his energy on making my life easier and more comfortable. One evening, while we were sharing a quiet dinner, I realized that I could no longer hide our relationship from my prestigious family, regardless of the inevitable storm. I looked at his calm face and decided it was finally time to introduce Silas to my parents, Lawrence and Judith, despite knowing their reaction would be harsh. The thought of Marshall, my arrogant brother, seeing Silas in his simple clothes made my stomach turn, with a mixture of anxiety and protective instinct. Silas noticed my hesitation, immediately setting his fork down with the same calculated precision he used when inspecting a faulty engine. "Are you absolutely certain that you want to bring me to meet them at this moment?" he asked, with a gaze that seemed to see right through my forced composure. I took a deep breath while explaining that our love deserved to be recognized regardless of the social barriers my family had spent decades building. Silas did not show any signs of fear or intimidation at the prospect of facing the most powerful judge in the city and his judgmental wife. He simply reached across the table to squeeze my hand, his grip providing the silent strength I needed to finalize the upcoming dinner arrangements. My mind began racing with potential arguments and insults my parents would likely hurl at him the moment he stepped into our grand family villa. I knew that the peaceful sanctuary we had built within this small apartment was about to be challenged by the harsh realities of the Savannah elite. Still, the unwavering confidence in his eyes gave me the hope that we could withstand whatever cruelty my relatives prepared for us. The introduction at our family villa took place on a high-pressure Saturday evening, as Marshall watched Silas with a look of pure disdain from the moment we stepped through the front doors. My brother Marshall deliberately kicked Silas's heavy work boots before making a cruel remark about the smell of grease lingering on his clothes right in the middle of our formal living room. My parents sat rigidly on their antique velvet chairs, radiating an atmosphere of cold judgment that made the spacious room feel suffocatingly small. Dad began the evening by launching into a calculated series of questions regarding the educational background and family lineage of Silas, with the obvious goal of publicly humiliating him. Lawrence leaned forward with his silver hair gleaming under the chandelier, his voice carrying the authority of a retired judge sentencing a criminal. The interrogation continued throughout the first course, yet Silas remained remarkably composed, while answering each pointed question with quiet dignity and intelligence. When Lawrence attempted to trap him with a complex legal hypothetical regarding maritime property rights, Silas responded with a sharp analysis that was so legally precise, it made my father freeze in stunned silence for several moments. Marshall broke the tension by laughing mockingly, though it was clear that even he was surprised by the effortless expertise displayed by a man he considered a lowly laborer. Judith sat across from me with her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting between Silas and the expensive silverware, as if she feared he might steal something. The situation escalated rapidly when Marshall suddenly reached into his coat pocket to pull out a thick stack of $500 bills and threw them onto the hardwood floor. "Take this money and disappear before I call security to throw you out of this house, Silas," he sneered while pointing toward the exit with a trembling finger. I felt a surge of cold fury rushing through my veins, but before I could speak, Silas looked directly at Lawrence with an unshakable calmness. "Is the honor of your daughter really worth less than this pile of loose change, Mr. Lawrence?" he asked in a voice that resonated with a power I had never heard from him before. The silence that followed was broken by my mother, who stood up to declare that my continued relationship with a man from the bottom of society would have immediate consequences. Mom stated clearly that she would strip away my inheritance and remove my name from the prestigious charity board if I chose to stay with Silas. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and disappointment, waiting for me to crumble under the weight of her financial threats. I realized in that moment that my family loved their social standing far more than they ever cared about my personal happiness or the character of the man I loved. Without saying another word, I reached out to grip the hand of Silas firmly before standing up to leave the mahogany dining table forever. We walked out of the grand villa together, leaving the stack of money untouched on the floor, as the angry shouting of Marshall echoed loudly behind us. The cool night air felt incredibly refreshing after the stifling hostility of the house I had once called home for so many years. I knew that by walking through those gates I was closing the door on my past, but the steady presence of Silas at my side made the sacrifice feel entirely necessary. We drove away from the estate in silence, both of us understanding that our battle with the Savannah elite was only just beginning. My heart pounded with the realization that I had officially become an outcast in the eyes of the people who shared my blood. Silas kept his eyes on the road, his grip on the steering wheel firm, yet he reached over to squeeze my hand as a silent promise of protection. I did not look back at the flickering lights of the villa, focusing instead on the dark path ahead of us that led toward a future we would have to build entirely on our own. The memory of the insults hurled by Marshall and the cold ultimatums from Judith fueled a new kind of determination within me to prove them all wrong. We were no longer just a couple in love. We were two people standing united against a world that refused to see the truth behind our chosen bond. 3 weeks before the big day, Mom arranged a fake tea party to force me into meeting a wealthy young man named Reed, whom she considered a perfect social match for our family. My best friend Sloane had secretly sent me a warning text earlier that morning, explaining that my family was plotting to humiliate Silas in front of the local elite during this event. I arrived at the garden terrace only to find Reed boasting loudly about how his family was planning to acquire all the shipping terminals in Savannah. He sneered while claiming that he would soon fire all the impoverished workers like Silas to make room for a more sophisticated automated system. Sloane was right. My family has truly gone insane over this hollow reputation. I whispered to myself while watching Judith nod in agreement with every arrogant word Reed uttered. The atmosphere felt thick with artificial smiles until Mom turned to me demanding to know why I would choose a common loader over someone who could save the Miller name. I stood up in front of the gathered guests to publicly reject her matchmaking attempts, while affirming that a snobbish man like Reed would never be worthy of comparison to Silas. My husband possesses more integrity in his stained work boots than this entire room has in their combined bank accounts, I declared before walking away from the stunned socialites. The retaliation from my father was swift and far more reaching than I had ever anticipated from a man of his legal standing. Lawrence became so enraged by my public defiance that he sent a formal severance email to over 200 elite guests, explicitly asking them to completely boycott our wedding ceremony. My name began appearing on local news blogs with fabricated stories meant to smear my reputation, while the Miller family attempted to cut off every professional path left in my career. I watched as my freelance clients suddenly canceled their contracts without any logical explanation, leaving me financially vulnerable just days before the ceremony. Judith even went as far as contacting our local church to suggest that the wedding should be canceled due to the supposed mental instability of her only daughter. The isolation felt total as the people I had known my entire life began crossing the street just to avoid making eye contact with me. Despite the mounting pressure, Silas remained a pillar of unshakable strength, holding me close every night while the world outside tried to tear us apart. He looked into my eyes with a calm intensity and softly promised that every person who had insulted me would be forced to bow their heads in apology on our wedding day. Those who believe they can control the winds of fate often find themselves drowned by the tide they tried to command, he told me while showing no fear toward the elite boycott. We spent our evenings finalizing the guest list for the few people who still dared to stand by us, including Sloan and a few of his colleagues from the docks. I realized that my family had spent years building a fortress of pride, but Silas was building a foundation of truth that no amount of social shaming could ever destroy. The gossip and the headlines continued to swirl around our names, yet within our small apartment there was a peace that the Miller villa had never known. As the date approached, the contrast between my former life and my future with Silas became increasingly clear with every cruel email I received from my relatives. My brother sent a final message mocking our small budget and predicting that our marriage would not survive the first month of genuine poverty. I chose not to respond, focusing all my energy on the man who had seen my worth when I was nothing more than a stranded driver at the port. We were ready to face the empty pews and the silent judgment of Savannah, knowing that our bond was forged in a fire that none of them could understand. Silas spent the final nights before the wedding making mysterious phone calls, his face illuminated by the soft glow of his laptop as he coordinated a plan that would change everything. The Savannah sky poured down a relentless torrential rain on the morning of my wedding day, creating a somber atmosphere as I stood looking through the stained glass windows of the church. I stared at the 25 rows of empty wooden chairs stretching across the left side of the aisle where my family was supposed to be seated. Not a single relative from the bride's side had appeared to support me, leaving a haunting void that echoed with the rejection of the Miller bloodline. Instead, the right side of the sanctuary was filled with Silas's colleagues, wearing simple yet neat suits, their presence offering a strange sense of solidarity in the face of my family's cruelty. Marshall sent me a mocking text message at the very last minute, along with a photo of our parents enjoying a lavish dinner at a 5-star hotel. Congratulations on officially becoming the poorest person in the state of Georgia. Jade, the message read, intended to shatter whatever resolve I had left. The ceremony proceeded in the absolute silence of those vacant seats, yet the sacred vows spoken by Silas carried a powerful weight that made my entire body tremble with emotion. He held my hands firmly while the rain drummed against the roof, his voice remaining steady and unshakable despite the lack of a grand audience. Do not look at those empty chairs anymore. Just look at me, because everything is only just beginning. He whispered with an intensity that promised a future far beyond the narrow expectations of Savannah High society. Silas's parents appeared in the front row, wearing outfits that looked modest at first glance, yet they radiated the unmistakable aura of people who stood at the top of the financial world. I watched as his mother offered me a gentle, knowing smile that made me feel more welcome than Judith had in my entire life. Sloane was the only person from my past who dared to show up as my maid of honor, her eyes red from crying as she prepared to hand us the rings. She had stayed by my side throughout the entire morning, shielding me from the nasty rumors and the cold silence of the people who had abandoned me. When it was time to exchange the rings, her hands shook with a mixture of pride and sadness for the friendship we were defending against the world. The priest's voice was the only other sound in the room, guiding us through a union that felt more like a revolutionary act than a traditional wedding. We were two people standing alone against a fortress of pride, yet I felt an overwhelming sense of peace as Silas placed the simple band on my finger. As the ceremony concluded and we prepared to walk back down the aisle, a sudden deep roar of heavy engines began to rumble from the church courtyard outside. The sound was so powerful that it vibrated through the floorboards, signaling a massive change that neither my family nor the local elite could have ever predicted. I looked at Silas in confusion, but he only squeezed my hand with a mysterious grin that suggested he had been coordinating this moment for a very long time. The heavy oak doors were pushed open to reveal a fleet of black limousines lining the driveway, their sleek surfaces glistening under the gray, rainy sky. Men in professional tactical suits stepped out with a level of precision that commanded immediate attention from the few onlookers standing near the entrance. My heart began to race as I realized that the man I had married was not merely a loader from the Savannah docks as everyone had so arrogantly assumed. The quiet dignity he had displayed during the insults at the villa and the tea party was now being replaced by the undeniable authority of a leader. Sloane gasped beside me while clutching her bouquet, her eyes widening as she realized the sheer scale of the resources currently surrounding the church. Silas led me toward the lead vehicle with a protective arm around my waist, his stride full of a confidence that seemed to dwarf the prestigious Miller name. We were no longer the outcasts of Georgia, but the central figures in a play that was about to strip the arrogance away from those who had discarded us. The rain continued to fall, yet it no longer felt like a cold omen of failure, but rather a cleansing force for the new life we were about to begin together. A convoy consisting of 10 deep black Cadillacs completely blocked the entrance to the grand banquet hall, instantly attracting the intense curiosity of every passerby in the area. The heavy vehicle doors opened simultaneously as the most powerful business leaders in the state of Georgia, men whom Lawrence had spent years begging to meet, stepped onto the pavement. My father stood near the entrance with a look of pure confusion, expecting these titans of industry to acknowledge his presence or offer a formal greeting. Instead, they ignored both Lawrence and Marshall, entirely moving with military precision toward the center of the hall, where Silas was standing. The gathered crowd watched in collective horror as these wealthy executives bowed their heads respectfully before the man they had all recently labeled a social outcast. "Mr. Chairman, all of our vessels have docked safely at the terminals, and we are now awaiting your next direct command regarding the Eastern Seaboard operations," the lead executive announced. The silence that followed was so heavy that even the sound of the rain outside seemed to vanish beneath the weight of this shocking revelation. Silas didn't flinch or look surprised by the sudden display of loyalty, accepting their reports with the calm authority he had possessed since the night we first met. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked at the man I had married, finally understanding the true meaning behind his mysterious late-night phone calls. The humble loader I had protected from my family's cruelty was actually the chairman of Vance Global, the massive empire controlling the entire logistics heartbeat of the coast. Vance Sr., The father of Silas walked through the double doors with an air of absolute dominance that made even the most arrogant socialites in Savannah shrink back in fear. He approached me with a warm expression that contrasted sharply with the cold judgment I had endured from my own blood relatives for so many months. He reached into a velvet box to present me with a diamond necklace whose value surpassed the entire Miller estate and every luxury asset they had ever owned. "Welcome to the Vance family, Jade, where we value loyalty and courage far more than the hollow prestige of a fading name," he said, while securing the jewels around my neck. Mom and Lawrence remained frozen in their tracks, as the realization finally dawned on them that the man they had called a bottom dweller held the fate of their company in his hands. Judith's face turned a ghostly shade of white while she clutched her pearls, her eyes darting between the Cadillacs outside and the powerful men currently surrounding her daughter. "Silas, this must be some kind of terrible misunderstanding, right?" she stammered with a voice that had lost all of its previous artificial confidence. Lawrence attempted to step forward to offer an apology, yet the wall of professional security detail immediately blocked his path, treating him like a complete stranger in his own social circle. Silas stood in the center of the gala with his arm wrapped firmly around my waist, projecting a level of power that seemed to vibrate through the entire ballroom. He looked directly at Marshall, who was currently trembling with a mixture of fear and humiliation while hiding behind our father's shadow. "From this moment forward, anyone who dares to touch Jade or disrespect her name is officially choosing to go to war against the entire Vance empire," Silas declared to the silent room. He did not raise his voice, yet the cold conviction in his tone made it clear that the time for mercy and second chances had officially ended for the Miller family. I looked at the people who had abandoned me at the church, seeing only the desperate greed in their eyes as they tried to calculate how to regain our favor. Sloane stood beside me with a triumphant smile, her unwavering support during our darkest hours finally being rewarded with the sight of our enemies crumbling. We were no longer the desperate couple fighting for a small piece of happiness in a rented apartment, but the new sovereigns of a world that had tried to crush us. Silas led me toward the exit, leaving the banquet hall and the shattered pride of my family behind as we stepped into the waiting lead Cadillac. The city of Savannah looked different from the back of the limousine, no longer a cage of social expectations, but a vast landscape we were now destined to lead together. Exactly 1 week after our wedding day, the business empire that the Miller family had painstakingly built over decades began to collapse like a row of dominoes under the direct orders of Silas. Vance Global officially canceled every single transportation and logistics contract with the firm managed by Marshall, plunging their operations into immediate and irreversible bankruptcy. I watched from a distance as the headlines detailed the swift downfall of the people who had once believed they were untouchable in the city of Savannah. Lawrence was stripped of his membership at the exclusive elite club after his private email boycotting our wedding was leaked and became a central point of public contempt. The very social circles he had spent his entire life trying to impress were now mocking his name in every luxury hotel and golf course across the state. Judith began calling my private number repeatedly to beg for financial assistance, her voice trembling with a desperation that I had never heard during my years of living under her roof. I remained cold and resolute while listening to her pleas, eventually telling her to learn how to live with the hollow honor she had always worshipped above her own daughter. "You chose the reputation of the Miller name over my happiness, so now you must find a way to let that reputation pay your mounting debts," I replied before hanging up the phone for the final time. The guilt that they expected me to feel never materialized, replaced instead by a profound sense of relief that the toxic cycle of our relationship had finally reached its end. Marshall attempted to find me at my new office building to beg for a way to save his failing career, but he could not even make it past the first layer of Silas's high-level security detail. I watched him on the surveillance monitors as he argued fruitlessly with the guards, looking smaller and more defeated than the man who had once thrown money at Silas's feet. He had spent his life stepping on others to maintain his stature, yet he now found himself at the bottom of the very social ladder he had used to punish me. Silas stood beside me with a hand on my shoulder, his presence a silent reminder that the people who only loved me for my utility were no longer part of my reality. The severance was absolute and permanent, as I felt no regret for cutting ties with individuals who only valued my presence when it benefited their own public image. We spent our final afternoon in the city packing the last of our belongings before heading toward the harbor where a private yacht was waiting to take us away from the ghosts of Savannah. Silas led me onto the deck of the magnificent vessel, the same calm intensity in his eyes that had first drawn me to him during that rainy night at the docks. We began our new journey together, leaving behind the poisonous memories of a family that only understood the language of currency and social standing. The ocean breeze felt like a promise of freedom, washing away the lingering bitterness of the insults and ultimatums I had endured during the past few months. As the coastline of Georgia began to fade into the distance, I realized that my true inheritance was not the money or the titles my parents had threatened to take away. My wealth was found in the unwavering loyalty of the man standing beside me and the courage I had discovered within myself to walk away from a golden cage. Silas watched the horizon with the confidence of a man who had reclaimed his world, but his primary focus remained entirely on ensuring my comfort and peace. We were no longer defined by the expectations of the Miller family or the secret corporate power of the Vance empire, but by the love we had forged in the face of total isolation. The sun began to set over the Atlantic, casting a brilliant golden light across the water as we sailed toward a future that we would define entirely on our own terms.
Xin chào các bạn. Trước khi kết thúc câu chuyện ngày hôm nay, tôi muốn các bạn hãy dừng lại một chút. Đừng vội bỏ qua giá trị thực sự nằm ở những gì chúng ta học được từ sự sụp đổ của gia đình Miller. Cá nhân tôi tin rằng sai lầm lớn nhất của Ramsey hay Judith không phải là coi trọng đồng tiền, mà là họ việc tự cho mình quyền chà đạp lên nhân phẩm của người khác dựa trên vẻ bề ngoài. Tình thân không bao giờ là cái cớ để chúng ta kiểm soát hay nhục mạ hạnh phúc của con cái. Một bộ đồ lao động có thể che giấu đi tư cách cao quý, nhưng một tâm hồn ích kỷ thì không có bộ vest sang trọng nào có thể che đậy nổi. Nếu là bạn có đủ can đảm để cắt đứt hoàn toàn với gia đình mình như cách Jade đã làm hay không? Hay bạn chọn cách tha thứ khi thấy họ đã lâm vào cảnh trắng tay? Nếu có ý kiến hay cách làm khác, hãy để lại bình luận ở phía dưới để chúng ta cùng thảo luận nhé. Cảm ơn các bạn đã lắng nghe đến tận giây phút cuối cùng.